Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Usually when we talk about a diagnosis in life, well, especially a medical one, there's this built-in expectation of absolute precision.
Right, you want it to be exact.
Exactly. We want it to be like engineering. I mean, you fall, you break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged, glowing white line on the black background.
Yeah, and the doctor just points to the screen, taps the glass, and says, there it is, that's what's broken.
Right. And as the patient, even though you're in serious pain, you feel this strange sense of relief.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's named, it's defined.
It's entirely binary, broken or not broken.
Right.
You can point to the exact millimeter where the trauma occurred, put a cast around it, and just, calculate the weeks until it heals.
Yeah, we desperately crave that kind of categorization.
We do. We want our pain to be visible, measurable, and above all, predictable.
But then you step out of the physical ER and you walk into the world of severe grief. You walk into this landscape of absolute catastrophic human loss, and suddenly, that x-ray machine we all rely on, it is completely broken.
Oh, completely. There are no clean lines anymore.
None. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, to put it mildly, it is incredibly murky. It's a fog. And we are so genuinely glad that you are here with us today, pulling up a chair, joining as the third person in this conversation, because we are wading right into the deep end of those murky waters.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, when the human mind is subjected to catastrophic personal loss, all of our neat theoretical categories, our neat theology, our comfortable assumptions about how life works, they are thrown into an industrial blender.
Yeah.
And what we're doing today is looking directly into that blender.
Exactly. And that is the entire mission of our deep dive today. We are taking an extensive, rigorous, and completely unvarnished look at Chapter 2 of C.S. Lewis's incredibly vulnerable book, A Grief Observed.
Such an intense book.
It really is. And to do this, we have a stack of sources laid out in front of us. We're specifically relying on two in-depth theological and exegetical analyses of this exact text. One is titled Shattered Images and the Immutable Sovereign, and the other is Faith Under the Harrow.
Right.
We are going to synthesize these papers, pulling out the most important insights to figure out what actually happens when pristine theology meets raw, bleeding agony.
And we really need to be clear about the stakes right from the beginning. For you listening right now, the stakes of this conversation could not be higher.
Absolutely.
We aren't just doing a dry academic literary review of some mid-century British author. We are examining how severe visceral grief fundamentally warps our perception of reality.
It actively corrupts our memory.
Yes, it tricks our own brains. It can completely distort our view of Almighty God. And most crucially, we are going to explore how the immutable, objective truths of Scripture, and only those objective truths, can rescue the human mind from its own dark, spiraling projections.
So, to really grasp the weight of this, well, we can't start with the theology. We have to start with the man. Before we look at what C.S. Lewis wrote in this book, we need to understand why he wrote it.
The historical reality.
Right. We have to move out of the abstract classroom idea of bereavement and step into the reality of a totally shattered human being. So let's paint the picture here. Most people know C.S. Lewis as the brilliant Oxford scholar, the tweed-wearing intellectual.
The towering apologist who wrote The Problem of Pain.
Exactly. The guy who quite literally had the answers for everything. He was the defender of the faith for a generation, and he was this lifelong confirmed bachelor until he was well into his late 50s. And then, well, everything in his perfectly ordered Daunish life was completely upended when he met an American poet named Joy Davidman.
And in the book we're looking at, he protects her identity. He refers to her simply as H for her first name, Helen. Their relationship is the absolute epicenter of everything we're going to discuss today. You have to understand the contrast here. Lewis was a man of high academia, steeped in medieval literature, deeply entrenched in the quiet, male-dominated world of Oxford common rooms.
Very stuffy, very proper.
Very. And Joy Davidman was a former member of the Communist Party. She was a brash, brilliant, abrasive New Yorker who had converted to Christianity. She brought a friction and a vitality to his life that he had just never experienced.
It was a total culture clash.
It was. They were married initially in a civil ceremony in 1956, which was actually just a pragmatic arrangement to secure her British residency so she wouldn't be deported.
Wow, I didn't realize it started that practically.
Yeah, but what started as a technicality blossomed into this profound, overwhelming, late-in-life awakening for Lewis.
It was like a dormant volcano suddenly erupting, but almost immediately, tragedy strikes.
Yes, it did. Joy was diagnosed with advanced bone cancer. It was devastating. They had a Christian bedside marriage service in the hospital in 1957, fully expecting that she would pass away very soon.
But there was a reprieve, a massive, unexpected reprieve. Our sources talk about this miraculous remission she experienced.
It was a temporary but glorious reprieve. For a few years, she recovered enough to go home. And during that time, they experienced this incredible intellectual, emotional, and spiritual companionship at his home, the Kilns.
That's amazing.
Lewis, looking back on this period, described it with a phrase that just stops you in your tracks. He said, "A noble hunger, long unsatisfied, met at last its proper food."
Oh, wow. That is beautiful.
It was the golden autumn of his life. But that food was violently snatched away. The cancer roared back. And Joy died in July 1960. She was only 45 years old.
Which brings us to the actual physical artifact of the book itself. I think this is so important for you listening to understand. Lewis didn't sit down at his typewriter with the intention of writing a best-selling Christian living book on how to grieve properly.
Not at all.
He didn't outline this for a publisher. In that same year, 1960, reeling from her death, he just started scribbling in these cheap, private exercise books that he had lying around the house. It was pure, unfiltered, desperate catharsis.
Just trying to get the thoughts out.
Yeah, he was writing to survive the night. And when the book was finally published in 1961, it wasn't even under his own name. He used a pseudonym, N.W. Cloak. And I love this detail from our sources. That pseudonym stands for Nat Wilk, which is an obscure Old English phrase that translates to, "I know not who."
That pseudonym is incredibly telling. I mean, he had to protect the raw vulnerability of these words. But he also perhaps felt a deep sense of disconnect from his own public identity. The confident Christian apologist, C.S. Lewis, felt totally obliterated.
He was a ghost of himself.
Yeah. And if we connect this historical moment to the bigger cultural picture, well, the context makes the text even more staggering. Lewis was writing this in mid-20th century Britain. This was an era defined by rapid, aggressive secularization.
Right, post-war cynicism.
Exactly. Immense post-war cynicism following the devastation of World War II. The traditional influence of Orthodox Christianity was plummeting. The theological landscape in the academy was heavily dominated by liberal Protestantism, which was, actively trying to demythologize the Bible.
Stripping scripture of the miraculous.
Yes, stripping away the bodily resurrection, reducing Christianity to just a nice set of moral ethics.
And Lewis was the guy standing on the wall fighting all of that off. I mean, he was the great, unyielding defender of supernatural, orthodox, historical Christianity. Millions of people looked to him to explain why God allows suffering.
Precisely. He had constructed this massive, brilliant, intellectually bulletproof framework. In books like The Problem of Pain, he so comfortably and eloquently articulated the reality of human suffering, the necessity of free will, the way God uses pain as a megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
It was a masterpiece of logical theology.
It really was.
Yeah.
But suddenly, that very framework was ripped out of the theoretical realm and thrown into the white-hot, destructive furnace of his own personal, agonizing bereavement. The public persona was stripped away completely in the privacy of those exercise books.
Okay, I have to bring in an analogy here because as I was reading our sources, this image just kept flashing in my mind. It is exactly what it feels like to read chapter 2.
Let's hear it.
Imagine you have this world-renowned expert structural engineer. This guy has spent 4 decades writing the definitive, globally recognized textbooks on how skyscrapers withstand seismic events.
Okay, he knows this stuff.
Right. He knows all the mathematical formulas. He understands tensile strength, load-bearing walls, fault line resonance. He has given 1,000 lectures on why buildings fall and how to keep them standing. And then, suddenly, he wakes up at 3 a.m. to find his own house violently tearing apart and collapsing around him in a magnitude 8.0 tremor. Now, here is the key. The theory in his textbooks is still completely sound. The physics haven't changed. The math is still true. But the existential endurance of being physically crushed under the rubble of your own roof in the pitch black is an entirely different reality than writing the textbook.
That is a phenomenal way to understand it. Chapter 2. A grief observed captures the structural engineer trapped under the rubble. He is bleeding, he is terrified, and he is realizing in real time that knowing the math doesn't act as a painkiller.
It doesn't numb the pain at all.
No. Knowing the structural integrity of the universe doesn't stop the immediate agony of being crushed. And our sources point out a deep theological reality here. Lewis's writing reflects the severe, unavoidable conflict between the fallen temporal order of nature, the world of cancer and death, and the eternal reality of the unseen world.
He is engaging on a deeply personal level with the groan of creation that the Apostle Paul talks about in Romans 8.
Right, where all of creation is groaning, waiting for redemption.
So what does a shattered mind do? When you are pinned under that rubble, how do you cope? Well, you turn inward. You retreat into your own head. And this brings us to an incredibly uncomfortable realization that Lewis makes, which really frames our next major point of discussion in this deep dive, the deep deceitfulness of human memory.
This is where it gets really unsettling.
It really does. We all think our memories are safe spaces, but Lewis realizes something startling about his own grief early on. He confesses that at first his grief mattered chiefly for its effect on himself.
Yes, the sheer, shocking egocentrism of sorrow. It's an appalling realization for a man of his spiritual stature.
It must have been horrifying to admit.
He actually goes back and rereads his own frantic notes from chapter 1, and he is repulsed to find that he is entirely self-absorbed. He's obsessing over how he feels, how empty his house is, how terrible his future looks.
Wow.
And the exegetical sources we are using highlight that this is actually a profound symptom of our fallen nature. There is a common cultural myth that bereavement automatically sanctifies people.
That intense suffering makes you instantly holy and pure.
Exactly. But Lewis discovers that, initially, suffering often acts as a mirror that unmasks the inward, selfish turn of the human heart.
Which is such a hard pill to swallow because memory is universally sold to us by our culture as our absolute greatest comfort in grief. I mean, you go to a funeral, and what is the number one thing people say?
If she will live on in your heart, you'll always have your memory.
Right. But Lewis, trapped in the rubble, starts to examine his own memory. And he realizes it is not a comfort at all. He starts to see his own memory as a terrifying, active threat to joy's actual, objective reality. And he uses this incredible, haunting metaphor of a snowflake to explain it.
The snowflake metaphor is chillingly accurate, and it cuts right through all of our sentimental ideas about grief. Lewis describes the process of human memory, like small, silent flakes of snow, slowly, almost imperceptibly, falling and settling over the real shape of the deceased beloved.
It just slowly covers everything.
Yeah, imagine a highly detailed, rugged statue out in a winter storm. Over time, the snow accumulates. The sharp edges, the deep crevices, the unique defining contours of that actual statue get buried under the snow.
Until there's no detail left.
Exactly. Eventually, what you are left with is just a smooth, generalized, soft mound of white. That mound of snow is entirely the creation of the weather, just as the sanitized memory is entirely the creation of the person doing the remembering. The actual person is lost beneath it.
And he doesn't stop there. He takes that horrifying thought a step further with what we can call the puppet realization.
Yes, of the puppet.
He realizes that this mental image he's forming of Joy, this soft, snow-covered version of his wife, is becoming a domesticated, perfectly compliant puppet. Think about it. If he wants the mental image of Joy to agree with his theology in his head, she agrees. If he wants her to smile affectionately at him in his memory, she smiles.
Which is so not who she was.
Right. Which, as we established earlier, is a complete contradiction to the actual living Joy Davidman. Lewis described the real Joy as having a rough, sharp, cleansing tang of her otherness. She argued with him. She pushed back.
Exactly. The real Joy Davidman was a distinct, sovereign individual created by God with her own will, her own flaws, and her own mind. She was not an extension of C.S. Lewis.
No, she wasn't.
And when we look at this psychological process through the lens of Reformed theology, specifically drawing on John Calvin's famous concept that the human mind is a perpetual factory of idols, we see the true danger of what Lewis is identifying.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Memory manipulation in grief is not just a psychological coping mechanism. It is a highly subtle, deeply insidious form of idolatry.
Wait, hold on. I need to push back on this because I think a lot of listeners are going to recoil at that word. Are we really saying that fondly remembering your dead spouse is idolatry? That feels incredibly harsh.
It is not the simple act of remembering that is idolatrous, but the corruption of that memory. We have to be very precise here.
Okay, that makes sense.
God gave us memory as a gift. But in our fallen state, when we replace the real, objective, historically existing person that God created with a subjective, sanitized fantasy of our own making, well, we are crossing a line.
We're replacing truth with a convenient fiction.
We are constructing an image in our minds that exists solely to serve our own emotional needs, and then we give our devotion to that image. We want a version of our loved one that never disagrees, never frustrates, and only comforts.
That's not real love.
No. True love, biblically speaking, demands reality. It requires the reality of the other person, including that cleansing tang of otherness. The biblical design for marriage is a covenant union of two distinct, different persons. It was never meant to be a person falling in love with their own echo.
Wow. That is deeply convicting. It really forces you to take inventory. I want you, the listener, to stop and really evaluate your own memories for a second.
It's a tough exercise.
It is. Think about past relationships, or loved ones who have passed away, or even friendships that faded. How much of what you are holding on to is objective truth? How much is the actual flawed, resistant, fiercely independent person that God made? And how much is a curated, smoothed-over puppet that your own mind has desperately designed just to comfort your own ego?
It serves as a profound pastoral warning. Our sources stress a crucial point of application here. We simply cannot entrust the ultimate reality of our loved ones to our own fading neurons.
It's way too fragile.
It is a terrifying fragility. We have to entrust them to the sovereign God who created them and who alone holds their identity perfectly intact.
Yeah.
Because if our only hope of preserving a person is our own memory, then as our minds age, as our memories inevitably decay, the person is lost all over again. We need a vault far more secure than the human brain.
And Lewis realizes this. He realizes that his internal vault is completely compromised. His memory is just an idol factory churning out puppets. And because the internal world cannot be trusted, his grieving mind frantically pivots. It looks outward.
Seeking some kind of anchor.
Exactly. It looks to society, to cultural comforts, to religious sentiments, desperate for a lifeline. But what happens in Chapter 2 is that Lewis systematically, almost violently, rejects every single one of them. And this exposes what we can only describe as the absolute bankruptcy of sentimental comfort.
He essentially goes on the offensive. He takes a sledgehammer to all the shallow greeting card consolations that well-meaning people offer the bereaved. He fiercely attacks what the sources call sentimental eschatology.
Let's talk about what he attacks, because it's so relatable for anyone who has been to a modern funeral. He talks about Mom's flower bed. This is the cultural idea that visiting the physical cemetery, planting flowers, and talking to the headstone is somehow actually visiting the person.
Right, which he rejects entirely. The body in the ground is not joy.
No. He also goes after the spiritualist ideas of what he calls cigar heavens. You know exactly what this is. It's the idea that heaven is just you, sitting in your favorite armchair with your favorite golden retriever, smoking a good cigar, playing golf every day.
Yes, exactly like Earth. Just slightly brighter and with no taxes.
He is incredibly harsh about the bad hymns and lithographs that dominate so much of cultural Christianity. You know, the ones that promise heaven is essentially just an eternal earthly family reunion.
And the reason he attacks these ideas so aggressively is rooted in his understanding of the brutal reality of time. Lewis realizes that time, on the plane of nature, is strictly linear and irreversible.
As he puts it in one of the most brutal sentences in the book, time itself is one more name for death. You cannot go backwards. You cannot rewind the tape.
But right here, we have to pause and address a really crucial tension that comes up in our sources. Because Lewis is wrestling with his own background here. He was a lifelong Anglican, and he definitely held some Anglo-Catholic sensibilities.
Oh, that's right. The part about praying for the dead.
Yes, in this part of the text, he actually mentions that he has haltingly tried to pray for Joy after she died, even though he notes that he had prayed for other dead people before, without that same hesitation. But with Joy, he finds himself stammering and halting.
This is a moment that requires very careful, firm, and impartial exegetical correction, which our Reformed sources provide beautifully. The text openly notes Lewis's bewilderment and internal friction when he tries to pray for his deceased wife. But we must look at this from a confessional, Orthodox Protestant standpoint, anchored firmly in Scripture.
Specifically, Hebrews 9:27.
Right, which states clearly, "It is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment." The biblical reality is that upon death, the state of the soul is eternally fixed.
So when someone tries to pray for the dead, they are essentially trying to negotiate with the reality that God has already completely settled. They're asking God to alter a decree that is already finalized.
Precisely. Praying for the dead is an unscriptural practice. It has no warrant in the Old or New Testament. It fundamentally clashes with objective divine reality.
So when Lewis internally halts or feels a deep block when trying to pray for Joy, our sources argue that this isn't just psychological confusion or grief brain. It is the natural, immovable resistance of objective reality pushing back against an unbiblical practice.
The dead are either instantly in the presence of Christ or they are facing judgment.
Exactly. Human petitions, no matter how desperate or tearful, cannot alter their postmortem status. God is not waiting on our prayers to decide the fate of those who have passed.
Okay, I have to step in and push back here. On behalf of anyone listening who has ever stood at a casket and lost someone they desperately loved, why is Lewis so incredibly angry at the idea of a family reunion in heaven? And why are the sources so critical of it?
It's a natural question.
Isn't that exactly what a grieving husband wants? I mean, when you are in the depths of loss, you want your spouse back. You want your child back. Why attack the hymns that promise we'll all hold hands on the farther shore and everything will be just like it was? It sounds like theology is just being cruel to a pleading man.
What's fascinating here is that this gets to the very core of our human frailty. The deep paradox is that Lewis does want exactly that. His raw, bleeding human emotion desperately wants the exact earthly past returned to him.
He wants the house back, the evening conversations back, the old life back.
But his sharp intellect, even in its shattered state, recognizes a profound truth. Wanting a mere repetition of the past is a fundamental failure to grasp the biblical doctrine of the resurrection.
It's essentially saying that our greatest hope is just hitting the rewind button. It's too small a hope.
Exactly. It is infinitely too small. True Christian eschatology, true Christian hope as laid out majestically by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, isn't an endless static extension of our domestic earthly habits.
It isn't a spiritualized version of your living room where you sit around and drink tea for 10 million years.
No, it is a radical, mind-bending, God-centered transformation. Paul says the perishable is raised imperishable. The natural body is raised a spiritual body, entirely animated by the Holy Spirit. If our ultimate desire is just cigar heaven, we're completely ignoring the supreme, enthralling, terrifying glory of the triune God, which is the actual blazing center of heaven.
Oh, I see it. We want the gifts without the giver. We want the people God made, but we want them abstracted from the God who made them. We want heaven to be about us, not about him.
Yes, we reduce the eternal weight of glory to a family picnic. And our sources make a very pastoral, yet firm point here. Offering grieving souls these sentimental, earthbound fables instead of the rugged, disruptive, massive truths of divine eschatology is like feeding a starving man poison coated in sugar.
Wow.
It might taste sweet for a second, but it offers absolutely no real nourishment, and it completely collapses under the crushing weight of real tragedy. When the 8.0 earthquake hits, a bad lithograph of angels in clouds will not hold your house up.
Which brings us to the most famous, visceral analogy in the entire book. With his internal memory exposed as an idol factory and all the external sentimentalities exposed as poisonous fluff, Lewis is left completely hanging in the wind. All the props have been kicked away.
He has nothing left.
He is left with absolutely nothing but his professed theology. But the terrifying question becomes, is that theology actually strong enough to hold his weight? And this is the test of the rope.
The rope analogy is brilliant, and it is arguably the most memorable insight Lewis offers. He writes that a rope might seem entirely dependable when you are merely using it to tie up a cardboard box.
Right. You can look at the rope, you can tug on it with your hands, you can admire how thick it is, and you can confidently declare to everyone around you, this is a very strong rope.
But you only discover its true strength, its actual integrity, when you are forced to tie it around your waist and hang from it over a terrifying bottomless precipice.
It's the difference between theoretical orthodoxy and battle-tested faith. It's the difference between acing a written exam on the theology of suffering and actually being diagnosed with terminal cancer.
Severe affliction is the ultimate, unavoidable diagnostic test of nominal faith. The Apostle Peter writes about this explicitly. He says that trials come so that the proven genuineness of our faith, which he says is of greater worth than gold that perishes, even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor.
Lewis discovers, to his horror, that debating theology at Oxford, writing The Problem of Pain, and even praying for the dead in the abstract, all of that was merely courting a box.
It was just theory.
But trusting the sovereign God of the universe with joy's actual agonizing, permanent physical absence, that is hanging over the precipice, feeling the fibers of the rope strain and pop.
And while he's hanging there in the dark, swinging over the abyss, he starts wrestling with Scripture. Specifically, he fixates on 1 Thessalonians 4.13. This is the famous verse where the Apostle Paul says, "Do not mourn like those who have no hope."
But Lewis, in his devastated state, completely misinterprets this verse, doesn't he? He reads it through the lens of his own inadequacy.
He does. He makes a significant, deeply emotional, exegetical error. Lewis assumes that Paul's command was meant only for what he calls our betters.
Like spiritual elites.
Right? He pictures these super saints whose love for God was so overwhelmingly vast, so pure, that it instantly swallowed up their earthly grief. Lewis looks at his own messy, angry, despairing heart and feels like he is failing the Christian test. He feels like he can't possibly live up to that Stoic standard of spiritual perfection.
But the sources we are looking at step in and correct this beautifully, because Paul wasn't writing a letter to a bunch of untouchable super saints who never cried.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Paul was writing to ordinary, working-class, terrified believers in the city of Thessalonica. These were people who were actively panicked that their deceased loved ones were going to miss out on the return of Christ.
Right. So what does Paul actually mean then?
Well, the syntax of the original Greek text is absolutely vital here. Paul does not forbid grief. He doesn't issue a cold command saying, do not mourn. He says, do not mourn in the same manner as the rest of the pagan world. The manner of the mourning is what distinguishes the Christian, not the absence of it.
Okay, let's explore that, because I think for you listening, understanding the cultural backdrop makes this verse explode with meaning. What was the pagan world actually doing when someone died? What were the options?
In the Greco-Roman world of the first century, you basically had two philosophical options when facing death. The high-minded option was Stoicism, which promoted the concept of apatheia.
Now, apatheia doesn't just mean apathy, does it?
No, it meant the complete disciplined eradication of emotional attachment. The goal was to numb yourself to the pain entirely. You suppress the grief until you feel nothing, because emotion is seen as weakness.
And the other option?
The other option for the common person was pagan nihilism. This was absolute, empty, wailing despair. The grave is the end, the person is annihilated, nothing matters, and the universe is a dark void.
So it's like having to choose between taking so many emotional painkillers that you can't feel your hand burning on a hot stove, or just throwing yourself entirely into the fire and letting it consume you. Those are terrible options. But Christian sorrow offers a completely different paradigm.
Entirely different. Christian sorrow doesn't demand the emotional amputation of Stoicism, and it doesn't surrender to the abyss of nihilism. Christian sorrow is permitted to be sharp, is permitted to be visceral, messy, and loud.
Because death really is an enemy.
Exactly. The tears are real because death is a real enemy. But, and this is the crucial distinction, Christian mourning is bounded by an objective historical reality. It is hemmed in by the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. We mourn, but our mourning has a solid floor beneath it. It doesn't fall into the bottomless pit of nihilism because we know the tomb is empty.
So what does this all mean? When we look at Lewis hanging on that rope, terrified that it's breaking, what we are actually seeing is a profound spiritual mechanism at work. Suffering doesn't actually create weakness in our faith. It exposes the weakness that was already there.
That's spot on.
It shows us exactly where our rope was frayed, where the fibers were rotting, long before we ever stepped off the cliff.
That is the ultimate pastoral warning of the rope analogy. It forces every single one of us to ask a terrifying question. Is our faith genuinely anchored in the living, covenant-keeping God of grace? Or is it just anchored in comfortable, untested theological abstractions that only work when we are healthy, when the bank account is full, and when our loved ones are safe?
And what happens when life is not going well? What happens when that rope starts to groan and snap under your weight? The mind plummets. When the pain becomes intolerable, you start looking for someone to blame. If I'm falling, who dropped me?
It's human nature to look for a culprit.
And that desperate search for a culprit leads Lewis and our deep dive into what is undoubtedly the darkest abyss of chapter 2. The mind plummets into questioning the very nature of God himself. We arrive at the terrifying concept of the cosmic sadist.
This section of the text is the emotional and theological nadir of the entire book. It is deeply uncomfortable to read. Lewis, pushed to the absolute brink of his sanity, considers a hypothesis that is, frankly, completely blasphemous. He wonders if the reason the universe hurts so much is that God might actually be a cosmic sadist.
It's shocking to hear that from him.
He uses terms that make you shudder. He calls God a vivisector, or an omnipotent tyrant.
We need to define that word to really feel the horror of it. A vivisector. That is someone who restrains and dissects living animals for cruel experimentation without anesthesia. Lewis actually equates human suffering to being rats in a laboratory, where God is just endlessly shocking us to see how we react.
Or he compares it to a dentist drill that just keeps drilling and drilling into a raw nerve, and the dentist never stops.
The darkness goes even deeper. He even turns his gaze to the most sacred event in human history, the cross of Christ, and he momentarily reimagines it in a demonic light. He considers the horrific idea that the cross was a cosmic trap.
He wonders if Jesus' cry of dereliction from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" meant that Christ had suddenly, in that moment, discovered that the Father was horribly and infinitely worse than he had ever supposed.
As if the whole incarnation was a vile practical joke finally sprung on an unsuspecting victim.
Exactly.
It takes your breath away that a Christian apologist of his caliber would ever put those thoughts on paper. To look at the cross and wonder if God was just betraying Jesus for sport. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because Lewis doesn't stay in that abyss. He doesn't build a house there.
No, he doesn't.
He pulls himself out of this terrifying, blasphemous downward spiral, and he does it through the sheer force of cold, hard logic.
It is a remarkable pivot. The very next morning, Lewis wakes up, he rereads his own frantic, ink-stained notes from the night before, and he identifies that terrifying accusation for what it truly was. He calls it a yell rather than a thought.
I love that distinction so much. A yell rather than a thought. Think about a toddler getting a life-saving vaccine at the pediatrician. To the toddler, the needle hurts, and the yell. In their mind, the doctor is a sadist inflicting arbitrary torture.
But it's an emotional spasm.
Right, it's a yell of pain, not a reasoned medical conclusion based on the facts of immunology.
That is a perfect parallel.
Yeah.
And Lewis dismantles his own blasphemy by looking at the facts of the universe.
Yeah.
He realizes that a purely sadistic deity, a malicious, chaotic power, could never be the foundational author of the universe we actually live in.
Why not?
Because a cosmic sadist could never create the capacity for love. He could never create laughter, or the beauty of daffodils, or the elegant, rational order of physics, or the deep, genuine comfort of human friendship.
That makes total sense.
Evil and sadism are parasitical. They can only corrupt what is already good. They cannot create. Therefore, a fundamentally sadistic God is a self-defeating logical absurdity. The knot undoes itself the moment you pull it tight.
But Lewis isn't entirely done swinging his sword, because as he's working through this logic, he takes aim at a specific theological tradition, and this raises a really critical point for our discussion today. Our sources point out that Lewis fiercely critiques what he calls extreme Calvinism.
Yes. In his anger, Lewis imagines a distorted version of Calvinism where God's goodness means the exact opposite of what human beings understand as goodness. He fears the theology that says God's goodness is actually what we would call cruelty, but we just have to blindly call it good simply because God is the one doing it.
Right. It's like a theological version of George Orwell's 1984. War is peace, freedom is slavery, cruelty is goodness, just redefining words to justify absolute power.
Precisely. This raises an important question because it strips language of all meaning. But our sources, writing from a deeply confessional Reformed perspective, step in here to clarify that Lewis is fighting a straw man.
He's attacking a caricature.
Exactly. He is attacking a complete distortion of historical Reformed theology. The tradition utterly, completely rejects this idea of arbitrary, redefined goodness. If God's goodness meant the opposite of human goodness, then divine revelation would be completely useless. It would communicate nothing.
Because the words themselves would have no fixed anchor. God says, I love you, and it could mean I want to destroy you.
Right, when God makes a promise, we couldn't trust it because a promise might actually mean a curse. And Orthodox confessional theology teaches the exact opposite. It teaches that God's providence is indeed meticulous. God is sovereign over every atom, and yes, his judgments and purposes are often totally incomprehensible to our finite creaturely minds.
But he is not malicious.
Unequivocally not the author of sin. His goodness is infinite, and it is archetypal, meaning human goodness is a dim reflection of his perfect goodness. It is not an inversion of the word good. When God declares in Scripture that he is loving, gracious, and merciful, those words have real, recognizable, objective meaning.
The mystery of suffering doesn't erase that.
No, the profound mystery of human suffering does not mean we are allowed to empty God's goodness of its actual content.
So let's connect the dots here. If God is not a cosmic sadist, and if his goodness is real, infinite, and trustworthy, we still have a massive problem on our hands. The dentist's drill is still spinning. The earthquake has still leveled the house. Joy Davidman is still dead.
The pain is still there.
Right. How does a perfectly good God actually intersect with our raw, bleeding human pain? And this brings us to the absolute climax of our deep dive today, the Christ connection. Because all of our theological maneuvering is useless if it doesn't lead us to the ultimate answer provided in these sources, which is the historical person and work of Jesus Christ.
Human grief, left to its own devices, will always descend into one of two traps. You'll either spiral into the idolatrous self-absorption of the fading memory we talked about earlier, or it will plunge into the blasphemous despair of the cosmic sadist.
There's no third option apart from Christ.
None. The only way human suffering finds true, lasting interpretation, and the only way the mind finds divine comfort, is through the eternal Son of God incarnate.
Christ is the man of sorrows from Isaiah 53. The God who did not stay sequestered in heaven, immune to the sting of death, watching us squirm like rats in a maze.
No, he entered fully, physically, and completely into the brokenness of the fallen world. And our sources point to a critical, revealing moment in the Gospel of John, chapter 11. It's the scene at the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus is standing there, surrounded by the grieving sisters, Mary and Martha. And the Greek text says something fascinating.
What does it say?
It says, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. The Greek verb used there by John is embryomai.
Now, I was looking at the commentary on this word embryomai, and it really struck me. It doesn't just mean a quiet, polite sigh of sadness, does it? It almost sounds like a physical anger. Why would Jesus be angry at a funeral if he knows he's about to raise the guy from the dead?
That is the perfect question. Embryomai captures a deep, visceral, holy indignation. It originally described the snorting of an angry horse going into battle.
Wow, that's intense.
It is an intense rage against the unnatural tyranny of sin and death that is ravaging God's beloved image-bearers. Jesus wept, yes, his tears were real, but he was also furiously angry at death itself. He saw the devastation of the grave, and he hated it.
And notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't pull Mary and Martha aside and offer them sentimental platitudes about Lazarus being in a better place.
No, he doesn't offer them cigar heavens. He weeps with them. He rages against the reality of the grave, and then he demonstrates his absolute sovereign power by commanding the dead man to come forth.
And understanding that furious, holy love completely shatters Lewis's nightmare vision of the cross, too, because the cross was not some vile practical joke played on an unsuspecting Jesus by a sadistic father.
Reformed biblical theology completely demolishes that error. The cross was the eternal, sovereign, unchangeable decree of the triune Godhead, planned before the foundation of the world. Christ was the divine covenant head who willingly, purposefully, and joyfully laid down his life for his sheep.
He wasn't tripped into it.
Not at all. When he cried out on the cross, he wasn't expressing intellectual disillusionment or discovering a cosmic trick. He was actively, voluntarily bearing the full, unmitigated, holy wrath of God against the sins of his people.
He was acting as our substitute. He was absorbing the shock wave of the 8.0 earthquake so we wouldn't be eternally crushed by it.
Yes. The theological term is penal substitutionary atonement. The Greek word used in the New Testament is hilasterion, a propitiatory sacrifice that fully satisfies divine justice.
Why does this matter to a grieving widower like Lewis?
Because at Calvary, divine justice and divine mercy kissed. The Father did not bruise the Son out of spiteful, arbitrary cruelty. He bruised the Son out of an everlasting, covenantal determination to save a fallen, rebellious people and permanently destroy the power of death.
God didn't remain distant from suffering. He plunged right into the absolute bottom of it. He took the dentist drill to himself. And that bodily resurrection on the third day, that historical fact, is the definitive, triumphant answer to the fading, subjective puppet memory we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly. This is where the theology becomes incredibly practical. We don't have to panic in the middle of the night that we are going to forget what our loved ones looked like or sounded like. We don't have to bear the crushing burden of relying on our own failing neurons to keep them in existence.
God preserves the identity of his people.
The resurrection is not a ghostly afterlife. It is bodily continuity under radical, glorified transformation. Joy Davidman is not saved by becoming a fading idea in C.S. Lewis's mind. She is kept securely by the power of Christ, and she awaits the literal redemption of her physical body.
Okay, so let's translate all of this massive, heavy theology into everyday, boots-on-the-ground action for you, the listener, because truth unapplied is just trivia, and we want to actually equip you for the inevitable days of darkness. How do we live this out when the phone rings at 2 a.m. with terrible news?
First, as our sources firmly demand, we must actively, consciously mortify the idolatry of subjective memory. When bereavement strikes, you will feel the urge to build mental idols out of the departed. You must resist it. You must entrust them to the righteous sovereign God who created them, knowing his memory never fails.
And second, we have to purge our communities, our churches, and our own vocabularies of cheap, sentimental pragmatism. We have to throw out the bad lithographs.
Stop saying things like, heaven just needed another angel.
Right, or offering empty Hallmark card platitudes that completely ignore the holy, terrifying presence of God and the gritty reality of the bodily resurrection. If someone is grieving, follow the command of Romans 12:53 and weep with those who weep.
Don't rush a grieving person into a performance of fake cheerfulness just to make yourself feel less awkward. Let them yell, but gently, patiently tether them to the objective truth of Christ.
And finally, the most urgent application. Prepare your faith before the storm hits. Examine the rope while you are still standing on solid ground. Dig deep into the robust doctrines of God's providence, our union with Christ, and the bodily resurrection while your mind is relatively calm and clear.
Because a theology that is based on light reading, catchy worship songs, and easy times will instantly snap when you are hanging over the precipice.
Wow. Think about the ground we have covered today. We have journeyed all the way from the initial blinding shock of the wound through the terrifying realization that our own memories are shattering and unreliable.
We navigated past the complete bankruptcy of sentimental cultural comforts.
And we hung suspended over the precipice, feeling the rope of our faith stretched to the breaking point as we confronted the horror of the cosmic sadist. And finally, through the logic of grace, we landed on the immutable, unshakable, fiercely holy goodness of a sovereign God who literally suffered for us.
It is a brutal journey, but it's ultimately a beautiful clearing of the rubble. It clears away the false comforts so that genuine, tested, God-centered faith can finally emerge from the ashes.
I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought. At the very end of chapter 2, Lewis doesn't tie a neat little bow on his grief. He leaves us with this haunting, totally unresolved image. He compares himself to a ship with one engine completely gone.
Just limping along.
Yes, limping slowly through the dark water, moving toward an uncertain, pitch-black coast. He doesn't know if there is a safe harbor waiting for him there or if it's just jagged rocks that will tear the hull apart. He is still in the dark.
The grief hasn't vanished. The drill is still drilling.
But here's the thought I want you to mull over as you go about your day. If you know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the captain of that limping ship has already passed through the ultimate crushing storm of death, if you know that he has already conquered the grave and that he holds the actual physical keys to reality itself in his scarred hands, does the darkness of the coast actually matter? Is that terrifying darkness just the temporary physical limit of your own mortal vision, hiding a magnificent harbor that has been guaranteed by covenant all along? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep thinking, keep testing your ropes, and keep exploring.